And without further ado, Gil Alexander from National Trust Scotland.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. I hope everybody can hear me at the back okay. So my title, 12th and 13th century cross slab grave covers in Renfrewshire, sort of says it all. I have a few confessions. I don't know much about the 12th, 13th century. I know virtually nothing about grave slab covers, but I know a wee bit about Renfrewshire. And I'm an archaeologist. So let's see if we can get this to work. Oh.
The directional arrows.
I'm doing the directional arrows down.
Should I click on the screen first? Yes.
Everybody's seen this, so I'm not going to do it anymore. Probably one of my confessions is that I don't know an awful lot about Stirling either. But 10 years ago, in 2014, we had an 850th celebration. No, like you've got to have a zero in the end thing to celebrate anything, which gives you an opportunity to look at the history and archaeology of any period in Scotland. So the 850th in Renfrew was all about the Battle of Renfrew. And we had this wonderful conference at which Ted Cowan was speaking, Alex was speaking, but in absentia. I think I read his paper for him. It was a thoroughly fantastic day looking into the history and presumed archaeology of the Battle of Renfrew in 1164. We all know that Somerled rode up the Clyde with a galley with about 80 or 90 galleys, and his main target was Renfrew Castle. Largely because of the power of the Stuarts was rising, or the Stuarts was rising. We know he landed somewhere near Greenock, we think somewhere in the Bay of St. Lawrence, although there's a possibility that he did tiptoe past Dumbarton Castle, which probably would have been held against him, got upstream to the confluence of the Carts and the Clyde, disembarked there, and basically was about to set about Renfrew Castle in style. This was in 1164. About this time of year, actually. He could have avoided going along the side of the Clyde there. It would have taken him into Strathgraith, one of the chief areas of Renfrewshire and one of the strongholds of the Stuarts' vassals, in which there are a number of well-known or lesser well-known archaeological sites, mottes and things like that. Who was facing him at this time, waiting for him at Renfrew, building his castles, extending his power across the west, was Walter Fitzalan. Obviously, he'd come across, like many of the Anglo-Normans, or the Norman and the Bretons, into the service of David I. Probably came up and he witnessed the charter in 1136 and was given lands in Renfrewshire. And we know in 1138, at the age of 32, he took troops down and fought at the disastrous Battle of Northallerton. I would imagine he was in that mounted brigade. But what are the archaeological connections with the Stuarts and Renfrewshire and that sort of period in archaeological and historical research? There's not been a lot done about where these guys came from and what sort of typical things we might be looking for. It would be good to do a bit more work across the nations, a bit like Duncan's work. That looks really exciting. Here we have Oswestry Castle, which was the head of the area that Fitzalan came from. His father built a castle there in 1155, and in 1165 it says that a garrison of 200 men. So, I mean, it was a pretty obvious large-scale structure. Walter the Stewart became High Steward in 1150, and he was given knights as part of that service of knights to the king. And obviously, with the death of David I, that is subsequently to Malcolm IV. And the big thing, obviously, from that point of view of the area is that in 1163, he invited monks up from Shropshire to create a priory at the town of Renfrew. And the subsequent year, they moved upstream to Paisley to create a monastic establishment there. And here we have a couple of the seals. Now, that was probably pretty much thumbing the nose at Somerled, and that's one of the things that I was trying to look at in our conference about the Battle of Renfrew was, well, what sort of archaeology is it that we have that characterises that period? As Duncan was saying, it's very difficult to put your finger on it and be able to immediately identify what those things might be. And very few of them have been excavated. So we've got very little in the way of good, secure dating evidence from the sort of sites. From a settlement pattern in Renfrewshire, we have three groupings, really. Oh, I need to turn it on, don't I? You showed me to do this. There we go, three groupings in Renfrewshire. Around Renfrew itself, Strathgrife and the area of the Mearns and Eaglesham. The contrast between the different settlement types really are ringworks around Renfrew, as far as we can tell, and mottes in Strathgrife and out towards the Mearns and Pollock, that sort of area. The ringworks have always been the ones that have been flagged up for Renfrewshire because of this one in the bottom right-hand corner built by Robert de Croc in the 1160s, I think, probably about that time. Earthwork mounded with a ditch in front, probably with a palisade. That's the later 15th century keep sitting in the middle. So it's the remains of that large enclosure that people have always said, well, that's the sort of things that you get in Renfrewshire, and that's what Eric Talbot was looking for when he was excavating sites from Glasgow University around Paisley and elsewhere. And there are other ones that have been suggested, Camp Hill and Castle Hill in Paisley itself, Byers Hill, which has been removed by a golf course. And this one here at Corsley Hill, which is where the Baroccan cross, which is now in Paisley Abbey, used to stand. It used to stand right on that little spot there. And you can see it's surrounded by three crop-marked ditches. It's never been excavated. Two of the ditches look like they might be something from an Iron Age type enclosure, bivalve enclosure, but there's a single smaller ditch that looks like it overlaps them that could be another phase. And again, it's been suggested as being the early castle of the Flemings, which are one of the families for the Houston Baroccan area. So, as I say, Renfrewshire was my wee patch of the world. I went off and did some work there many, many years ago, pulled together a little booklet on it, and went round and had a look at the surviving evidence of the upstanding earthwork. They're not big mottes. The only one's got a bailey. So they're not characteristic of the sort of areas that we're looking at up in Murray or down in Galloway, where David I was undertaking campaigns to control some of the more unruly parts of the country. Maybe these acted simply as outposts, signal stations, hunting lodges in Strathgrife, Forest Park sort of areas. But again, it's worth looking at them in a bit more detail at some point. It would be great to do some excavation. Ranfurly on Ranfurly Golf Course, if anybody plays golf, is a very nice one. And Milton Bridge at Danielston, Denniston is right beside Kilmacone. And in this little scarp on the side here, I picked out a piece of white gritty ware pottery along with a 15th century jeton, so counting piece. So these things are subsequently used in law and in courts in the later medieval period. So they have a long use. And in fact, we were talking earlier on about the possibility of reused barrows and things like that. Something that we see probably in this location, certainly in Ayrshire for part of the world. The only site that has a possible bailey attached is the Grife Castle in Bridge of Weir, if you get a chance to go and look at that. But again, not much to be said from the secular evidence at this point. It would be great to do that. And from a countrywide national point of view, there's been quite a lot of survey work done on one or two excavations, but it would be really nice to do more. But we're looking at it from the ecclesiastical point of view today. And I knew virtually nothing about this. There have been various conferences and meetings at Paisley Abbey. Many of you will recognise it. There's been quite a lot of excavations, excitement over the drain, which runs through here, nicely marked by these flower beds, pretty much coming through in that direction. But the larger monastic vallum and enclosure takes in the area outlined in grass and mown grass in that part of Paisley itself. course, the graveyard out the front here is the bit is all now grassed over, and it's very difficult to see. But we know about a number of the earlier church sites, the parish churches that are associated with Paisley Abbey. So it's quite a nice thing to go and start to look for evidence that goes with that, with the same sort of time of the 12th century, and how that might be reflected in the archaeological evidence across the county. The priory site at Renfrew is obviously subsequently replaced by Paisley Abbey itself, but we have a whole series of other little parish churches and chapels across the county, of which one or two have quite good survival at. So we've got Mearns, we've got Neilston, Cathcart, Killellan near Houston, Kilbarchan, and Lochwinnoch, Castle Semple sort of area, if you know this part of the world at all. But there are other churches associated with Paisley Abbey, and again, it seems odd that we haven't started to look for connections between them, both in an archaeological and an architectural point of view, to see whether there's any crossovers. So we have the Renfrewshire ones on the top that I've mentioned, most of them, but there's also a series throughout Ayrshire. So we've got Largs, Prestwick, Monkton, Bunbury, Straighton, these sort of ones, and then further afield into one or two over in the east, in the east sort of borders, but also out into the outer stretches of the Firth of Clyde and into Argyll. This was my first introduction to medieval gravestones. It's right beside the little building in Kilbarchan called the Weaver's Cottage in Kilbarchan. There's a 17th century church in the background here, but what we're looking at here is this stone built into the wall of the graveyard in the foreground, which has got the remains of a little cross with a floriated top to it and a sword on one side. And that was the first time I'd really seen or taken an interest in gravestone. No, like you get older, you start to get interested in death. Well, I've got to that stage now, so I've moved through the fighting and the motts and the bailies, and I'm getting on to death. So I decided what I'd do is go and do a wee drawing of it, just because it's quite hard to see. So you can just about see the sword and the little pommel here, straight quillings there, and quite a nice shaft. It's obviously been cut off at the bottom by the masons who are building the wall around the graveyard here, in order to make sure that it fits in and fine. So that started me off on a wee adventure, going around parish churches and people looking at me strangely, saying, what's that man doing taking photographs in the graveyard? So I did drawings of them all back in 2013, 2014 for the conference, and I produced some of them. I've seen other ones subsequently, but I've also just gone back and taken photographs of them all for photogrammetry purposes. So maybe most of you know what photogrammetry is. You take multiple images from around a structure in relatively even light, and it will produce you a 3D model of it. So it saves you drawing it. So I didn't need to do it all those years ago. But actually, that's not true. And it's another thing. It's about having multiple ways to view things. So drawing will give you one thing. Photography will give you something else. Photogrammetry will give you something else. Combining the lot helps you enormously. And I think it's just a good way. It's also a good way to preserve things for the future in terms of information. These things are eroding at a rate of knots. So that's the photogrammetric model. So you can just see, you can start to play about with the light here, but you'll see the cross shaft and the foliage on the top of these sort of elongated spearheads or bits of vegetation at the top of the cross here. So you can start to compare them with other sites. One of the other sites that I looked at very early in the exploration was Mearns Kirk here, where this big, chunky, flat grave slab was leaning up against the wall just beside the entrance into the church. And again, it's got a really nice early-looking sword to it with a rounded pommel, straight quillings there, nice blade chopped off at the bottom there, and chiselled out circle wheel around the crosshead itself, but very simple in design, which makes me think, is there some sort of chronological arrangement in this, or am I just making that up? And I might just be making that up. But again, photogrammetrically, you can see it all peels out quite nicely. And see, the other good thing about the photogrammetry is you can remove, your eye is drawn by the lichens and the differences in colours. So when you take that away, you just see the chisel marks, the incisions, and where it's been cut out. So lots to be done. Houston Killellan Church, way out, was part of a conservation project back in actually 2013, I think it was. And during that work, this little sword was identified, built into one of the alcoves at the back of the church, in the back wall. I drew it at the time. It's an odd looking little thing, and it obviously has some sort of lobed pommel on it, and a little knob on the end of the pommel here, but it seems to be a sort of flat dome and a straight, and again, straight quilling, but a very, very thin looking, feeble looking sword. And you can see actually the difference between when it was conserved and now the moss that's starting to cover it. And I think it's looking in poorer nick than it did actually 10 years ago. So the photogrammetry wasn't quite as good as on this one, but I wasn't going to be peeling any of that stuff off. Probably the prize site to look at from this point of view is the stones at Inchinnan, moved from the old Inchinnan Church, All Hallows, beside in the flight path of Glasgow Airport, shifted in the, I think probably in the 60s or the 70s, and built a new church. The ones that get all the attention are the ones from the Govan School of Carving, which are actually on the other side of the church. These are largely forgotten at the back. So the earlier ones, the 9th, 10th century ones, are around in a caged thing, keeping it away. These ones are out in the open, and the kids can run all over them when they go in. So 10 of them there, which I did a drawing of again, and a mix of medieval motifs and sword motifs across them. You can see some of that on this drawing, but obviously many of them were reused in the 17th century. That's where the initials and the dates are from. But Megan Caston at Glasgow University identified this one here, some subsequent work, as being actually probably likely to be of the Govan School of the 9th, 10th century, rather than medieval from the, I'm saying from the 12th, 13th century onwards. But the rest of them certainly look to be of that. So you can see a bit more of the detail of some of them here. Some of them have got again, swords down the side drawn on them, but not with straight quillions this time, with curving simple ones on that as well. So again, just showing 3 here with the photogrammetric work. So it's, some of it's good detail, some of it's not so good detail. They have done these ones with laser scanning and with RTI imagery as well, and that does produce a better result, there's no doubt about it. But this is quite a handy way to look at things. Other ones across the county that haven't had as much attention and more difficult to find. Neilston, here found during an excavation, Old Cathcart and Loch Winnoch, which I've still to yet set eyes on. So there's some that are out there. And then probably the best ones are at Paisley Abbey itself, and they were known from the 1900s when these 2 magnificent sandstone grave covers were found underneath the pillars of the southwest corner of the tower when it was rebuilt in 1900 by Thomas Ross, him of McGibbon and Ross, and that sort of work. So from that area there. And I went along to see if they were there, and they're still there. They're in the cloister area, just with other stones stacked on top of them. So you clear them aside, and altogether there's 8 of these very nice grave covers in there. And again, these ones are quite nice, very fresh looking, because they were buried upside down, face down. So in fact, the stones look better than the photogrammetric models, which is often the way. But these nice bracelet-shaped crosses at the top. And others, in a wee sword there. Another less clear one. I mean, these 2 are my favourites because they're in the step, built into the step. People walk over them every day going into the chapel at the back of just off the nave of the church at Paisley. And so another little sword there. So, but what are the dates of these things? Well, you know, they're debatable in terms of the design of them. But of course, recently we've had some good discoveries. So we have the stuff from what was out in front of my old office window. I worked there for about 10 years, looked out onto the tarmac there in the car park at Old High School Yard, and then 20 years later, somebody dug up a skeleton and a whole series of other burials and this wonderful grave slab, which produced a date from the individual underneath of 1215 through to 1395, although the argument is that it's actually probably towards the later 13th century more than anything else. And then, if you've been keeping an eye on the papers recently, the mortar wreck down in Poole, dating to the reign of Henry III, dendro dated this time to 13th century, had two fantastic Purbeck marble carved grave slabs on it, and this one displayed arm cross and the other the wheel-headed cross. So there's plenty out there, and it's about trying to work out where they are, how they're associated with parish churches, what date they might be, and there's lots of other examples to be found. It'd be great to pull it together from a national overview. Dundee did some laser scanning, and I put this one up on the side so that you guys over there could read it deliberately. You know, that way you take something on your phone and it changes it. So the Commission have done lots of really good survey work over the years in their inventories, some brilliant pulling together. The guy who's been doing lots in the borders, Peter Ryder, did all his stuff in the north of England as well, and some stuff up in the Black Isle, again by Jim Mackay. So there's lots of regional studies, and what would be nice, I bet there's some similar stuff in Stirlingshire and in this area too, that we could pull together and maybe start to tell a bit more defined stories of what was going on. Somerled was killed at the Battle of Renfrew. They hacked his head off and they took it to the Stewart and to the Bishop of Glasgow. But it definitely, what's reflected in the settlement pattern and the burial record from the medieval period, from the 12th and 13th century in Renfrew, is the really solidification of the Stewart power in the west of Scotland. So much so that just under 100 years later, when Haakon comes knocking on the door of a wider Stuart Empire at the Battle of Largs in 1263, he is summarily sent packing at the same time. So it would be great to pull together some more of the archaeological and historical evidence for that period, from David I really right through to the end of the 13th century. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.